Good day, everybody. Welcome to Faith Seeking Understanding. I am Alan Bevere, your host. I am a pastor, retired, a professor, a Bible moth, a foreigner and exile in a strange land, getting stranger every day. And I'm also a peddler of hope, and I am the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury Chair of Podcast Theology and Culture here at Faith Seeking Understanding University, a completely fabricated institution of higher learning, but where all seekers are invited to ponder profound things. And I am very pleased to have on this episode of our Courageous Conversations, my friend and colleague, Vicar Derek Kabilas, who is the pastor, the vicar at Ashland First United Methodist Church in Ashland, Ohio. He's been a friend for a while now, and he actually is my successor. I retired from Ashland First, and he came as the pastor after that. Derek, how are you today?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Well, listen, I'm glad that you have consented to do this, and we're going to talk about your very thought-provoking book, Holy Hell, A Case Against Eternal Damnation. And for those of you who are either watching or listening, we will put links to all this in the description so you can access it. Um, Derek, I really enjoyed this book. Uh,
Mm,
I think it's very clear that you know your material and but you tell it, you present it in an accessible way. And one of the things I really like about the book is that you tell stories, sometimes personal stories. Also, you give images and metaphors, which is a very pastor thing to do, right? Tell
yeah.
stories, give images, and that helps people to understand. So I just appreciate the work that you did on this, and it's a really good, thought-provoking book. And I tell you, I'm with you. I'm with you on almost everything, I got to say. I'm going to quibble with you a little bit at the end, ask you a couple of questions, but other than that, we're just going to go through and let's just talk about the issue of hell and heaven. You and I come on from similar backgrounds,
Yeah.
a more evangelical background, I'd say, in which we were raised that, there's heaven and there's hell
hmm
and its punishment and things like that. Um, you challenge that in the book. So let me ask you first, um, what motivated you to write this book?
Um, well, I kind of came to this understanding of being what we call a purgatorial universalist or a patristic universalist in the midst of preparing a class in one of my churches. I teach these very short term, like 8-week classes in pretty much every church I serve. And I just kind of make them up out of whole cloth. And I kind of ask them what they would like to hear about, that sort of thing. And I had a number of people tell me they wanted a class on heaven and hell. And I had never really taught that much. I mean, as a preacher, I don't know, what you were like, but oddly, I'm a United Methodist. It's not like we talk about heaven and hell that much. You know what I'm saying? We're not the kind of people to give a lot of altar calls. We're not the kind of people to warn folks about fire and brimstone and stuff like that. So it was a real challenge. And in the midst of that, in the midst of interrogating my own beliefs on the subject, um, I kind of fell in line with this position. And then when I taught the class, I was shocked at the trauma I saw from people. People who had lost friends, neighbors, relatives, children, spouses who died sort of outside of the faith, outside of the church, and they were scared to death at the idea that their loved one was being tormented. In some, the way some people formulate it, being tormented by the very God that they worship on Sunday mornings, right? And a lot of tears in that class, a lot of people expressing this confusion about why God would allow something like that. And eventually, something clicked inside of me that said, I want to write something that will give folks hope and take away some of that fear. And also, I think, make a case that Christianity and the God Christians worship is not nearly as mean as what that God has been made out to be.
Yeah. Yeah. You say in your book, you say, let's be clear, to believe in a hell of endless torment is to believe that God tortures.
Mm-hmm.
There's really no way around that.
No, you can say, in evangelicals will often say, well, we choose hell for ourselves, right? Um, but yet God would have been the one who instigated this system, right? God would have been the one who set it up. Or some people say, well, hell is just the absence of God, trying to make it sound less personal, less like God is responsible for the pain that happens there. That doesn't even logically make sense in the Christian tradition. Because if we take Paul seriously, when he says God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being, to be separated from God entirely would be to be separated from the font of existence, the one who infuses us with being. It would be to not exist, which is a pretty good argument for a different position that I don't advocate for in this book, which is called annihilationism. But it doesn't make sense if we're talking about a hell of eternal torment. God must be there. God has given his will to it. And God is the one, because if you imagine for a moment that souls are locked in this place we call hell, they're being tormented. At some point, they must feel sorry for what they've done, right?
Right.
At some point, compunction must come upon them. And we are saying that God turns off God's ears to that God ignores it, that for some odd reason, because death has happened, that God no longer listens to the cries of those who want to have a relationship with God. So it people try to soften it. People try to soften who God is in relation to it. But I think you just can't get around the fact that if a hell of eternal conscious torment exists, then God is responsible for it. Yeah. And that means God is okay with torturing eternally.
Yeah. Yeah. So your position is universalism. So why don't you outline briefly for us what you mean? Because again, the terms of themselves are not helpful unless we, articulate them. So when you say you are a universalist, what does that mean?
Yeah, and that word especially is radioactive for a lot of different Christians. So when I talk about my universalism, I usually talk about either purgatorial universalism, or sometimes it's called patristic universalism. This is different than the kind of Unitarian universalism some people might be familiar with. The big difference I want to make is that what I'm talking about is not pluralism, right? This is not somehow all religions are equally true. We're all holding on to a different piece of the elephant. Everything is equally valid. That's not what this is. I am a Christian, and I believe Jesus Christ saves. The difference is that I believe that Jesus Christ saves everyone eventually. That at the end of existence, at the end of this earthly world, um, there will be no remainder to what God has redeemed. That God's redemptive victory is complete and total. And that if any being remained outside of God's redemption, then God just wouldn't be God. God's victory would be hollow, especially if they remained outside of God's redemption for all eternity, right? That when Paul uses the term apokatastasis, the Greek word, it's usually translated as the reconciliation of all things or the redemption of all things. We mean of all things, that everyone on a long enough timeline in this world or the next comes back to God.
Okay. Before we can move on with that, and I've got a couple questions, I want to kind of get one thing out of the way because I think this is important. But one of the things about your book that is important
Yeah.
is you put to rest a kind of pop evangelical theology that says universalism is basically a modern liberal doctrine, right? This is what I used to believe and was told, that universalists are just liberals who don't think God has any conviction.
Kumbaya.
Kumbaya. And, that's what that is. But the reality is, universalism in some form has gone back to basically almost the beginning in Christian reflection, hasn't it?
It's very difficult to find a time when the universalist hope wasn't represented somewhere in Christianity. In the earliest centuries, it was the dominant way of thinking about things in and around the city of Alexandria in Egypt. And it was a minority position elsewhere. There are a lot of people who were universalists that even a lot of Christian academics might be surprised to know, right? Like Origen of Alexandria famously was a universalist, but also Gregory of Nyssa, right? Also St. Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin. These things there has always been a struggle within Christianity to interpret those last things, the fate of souls. And it's precisely because I think the language that God uses, or that is used in the Bible, and particularly the language Jesus uses, is very poetic, right? It has an air of poetry about it, and we can talk about some of those terms, but it is deeply symbolic. There's a lot of metallurgy in it. There's a lot of weird themes, and at some point, the decision was made to just make it cut and dry, at least in the Western Church. That no, we're just talking about either heaven or a hell of eternal torment, and that's it. And we started to build this little, what I call bureaucracy of the afterlife around that dichotomy between those two states. And, as to the kumbaya thing, I try to be really clear that I want the church to take Jesus's warning seriously. Okay. Jesus is trying to warn us about something. When he talks about the outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth, he is describing something that is best avoided, right?
Right.
When Jesus talks about Gehenna or the gates of Hades, he is talking about something that we can, on this side of the grave, prevent happening to us on that side of the grave. It is real. It does appear to hurt, but it is also something that if we do go through it, it will be for our own good and our own spiritual rehabilitation. Um, I think one of the reasons why I was open to this view in the first place was because I lost my leg, as you well know, in the year 2012. And I had to go through extensive periods of rehabilitation to learn how to walk again, to walk with a prosthesis. And it was very painful. It was absolutely mind bendingly painful at times. But it was a pain that I endured for my own good, right? And that's why we call it purgatorial universalism. It's about purging something out of us to make us fit to spend eternity with God. I talk about it is something akin, if you remember the throne room scene in Isaiah, where the seraph picks up the coal and he's got to use tongs, first of all, right? A seraph, which is like the translation is the fire, right? This fiery angel. This coal is so hot that even he has to use tongs, and he touches it to the lips of Isaiah, and it's a purification because he's about to be in the presence of God. That is the kind of fire that we're talking about.
Yeah. So then when you talk about, I mean, because I want to be kind of clear here, purgatorial universalism,
Mm-hmm.
that there is, do you distinguish from the Catholic doctrine of purgatory? Do you got a little bit of a different view, or are you?
Yeah, it's different. It essentially, so for Catholics, right? As well as I can understand it, not being a Catholic, purgatory is a place where Christians go to have their venial sins burnt away or dealt with in some kind of way before they can go into heaven. The Christians who go straight to heaven are what we refer to as saints, right? But for Catholics, most Christians who are in right relationship with God have to go through this period of cleansing, of purging, this purgatory. And the funny thing is that a lot of evangelicals don't realize, and a lot of just Protestants generally, is a lot of the passages that they use to describe that from the Bible are the very ones that we use to describe hell.
Right.
And so the argument of the purgatorial universalist is that essentially Catholics are not wrong in this kind of in believing in this kind of temporary purgatorial state. We just believe that everybody goes there, that everybody has some kind of sin to burn away, whether you had a relationship with Jesus on this side of the grave or not. You still have to deal with the very real poison that you take with you into the afterlife. And so it is a lot like Catholic purgatory, except we believe that non believers can participate in it and will participate in it as well.
Okay. So then what do you say to the person who says, Paul is clear, you have to confess Jesus. If you confess with your mouth, right, that Jesus is Lord and that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. I mean, what about all these people that don't confess Jesus? Are they going to this? You say they are. Well,
Yeah.
what does that do? What does that do with the confession of faith in Jesus?
Well, I mean, I would say, first of all, I believe that's true as well.
Mhm.
But that confession may not be made on this side of the grave, right? I would also remind them that Paul said, it's the same Paul that said, just as all have died in Adam, so all are made alive in Jesus Christ, right? The same universality that Paul applies to sin coming into the world through Adam, he also wants to say is dealt with in Jesus Christ. Or you can talk about the Philippians 2 Christ hymn, where one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, right? I would say that they must not take it all that seriously, because if you have people who are still in hell, or particularly, and this is where it gets most abrasive for some people, think of a character like Satan, right? And especially if you consider him to be like John Milton's version of Satan, the unconquered will, the one who continues to shake his fist at God for all eternity. Um, no. Eventually, every knee will bend and every tongue will confess. Those are not coercive acts, those are acts of a free will. Eventually, everybody comes around to making that confession. The question for us that is most pertinent for us on earth is whether we will make that confession now and begin the process of sanctification that will keep us from having to experience the full pain and the full extent of that very difficult process of rehabilitation.
Okay. Yeah. So reading Tom Wright on this, because Wright will say
Mm-hmm.
that from his perspective, it looks like that once death happens, that's the it for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, as I was reading your work, I was thinking, okay, you clearly read these passages differently uh, from Tom. Uh, so you're saying that death does not, it's not the cutoff point.
No, and I'm curious about why that has become the default position,
Mhm.
at least in Western Christianity. What in the Bible, and I would be interested to hear that from him. Where do you read that there is a kind of ceiling of faith, like a ceiling of one's destiny at the moment of death?
Yeah.
Right? That seems arbitrary and very inconsistent, I might add, with so much of the Bible that wants to say that there is a relational continuity between us here on earth and those in the afterlife, right? I'm thinking specifically of uh, in Hebrews, right? We are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Or if you think about Samuel being summoned by the witch of Endor, um, those passages seem to indicate that life on the other side of the grave is not so much different than life on this side, and it it just strikes me as arbitrary
Yeah.
that that is a kind of cutoff point.
Yeah, that would be a great question to ask Tom, because I've heard Tom say that what you just said, there's a continuity between our life here and the next life in perfection. So it would be interesting to kind of but that stood out to me as I was reading what you were reading, how you were interpreting those passages. I mean, one of the things that I think uh is important is that I do personally, even though um I'm kind of like Karl Barth. I go to the precipice of universalism and get ready to jump into it, and then I just can't quite do it.
Hmm. There's a
So
lot of folks like that.
so I kept reading your stuff saying I'm with you, I'm with you, I'm with you. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But it is hard for me now to think about the fact that if there is a person that goes to hell in the afterlife, and that person finally said to God, Uncle,
Yeah,
I that God would say it's too late. Um,
yeah,
I I I don't read anything in the New Testament that tells me that God would say, I'm sorry, the time has passed. That's not fathomable to me uh, when I think about the character of God.
yeah. I mean, so if we're going to take Jesus seriously as being the revelation of who God is, right? The first and most basic thing that I feel like that Jesus teaches us about the character of God is that God is to us as a father, right? My father and your father, he says. And when I think about it that way, I find myself in the same position you do. It is in, and I talk about in the book, my cousin who went to jail for murder. And my aunt continues to visit him every week.
Hmm.
You know, he did this terrible thing, but the love of a mother is undaunted by that, right? She continues to love him. She continues to support him. She continues to visit upon him. In the same way, uh, one of the things I've talked to people about in person is imagine that you grew up with a fantastic relationship with your parents and you loved them, they loved you, bedtime stories, go to all your games, your artwork is up on the fridge, all of it. And then one day you're a teenager and you find a secret trap door in your basement. And you find out that this whole time that you have been in this loving relationship with your parents, they have been torturing a sibling of yours in a dungeon. That they've had your little brother, little sister, um, kind of strapped up on a board somewhere. And the whole time you were singing their praises, they were inflicting this pain on another one of their children. That would cause you to rethink the relationship you had with them, right? But that is precisely the kind of thing Christian preachers tell their parishioners to think about their own God all the
Yeah.
time. God is loving. God has infinite love. God is love. Um, and oh yeah, there are some of us that are going to be tortured forever and ever. Um, and if you go back to the Tom Wright thing, you know, if you want to say that death is this cutoff, then that creates some problems for even those of us that are in this life, right? Because if now you only have 90 on the good end, 90 short years to prevent this fate in as many people as possible. And remember, I like to say when you're talking about hell, you're not talking about a bad thing. You're talking about the worst imaginable thing that humans have ever come up with. You only have 90 years to make as big of an impact as you possibly can. How can we therefore defend doing anything but constantly evangelizing. How can we defend going to the movies? How can we defend having a dinner? How can we defend taking time to read a novel or crochet a blanket? Any of these things, um, if these are the stakes and people are falling into this infinite abyss every day, I happen to think if we really truly believed that, we would never have children, because we would think it immoral to possibly expose a soul to that worst possible fate. Um, but no, we do those things. We do enjoy life. We do have a sense of calm about us. Why? Because there is a voice that is inside all of us that says everything is going to be okay. That in the end, everything is going to work out. And I'm just trying to hopefully get people to listen to that voice and to be able to take comfort in that.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was a powerful point you made, that if we really seriously believe this, then we would be evangelism. We'd all be evangelizing full time. Uh,
Yeah.
because if hell is what we say it is, then why would we not? Right. So
Yeah.
it's a good point. It's a good point. So I want to ask you about two more things before we wrap this up. The first is I think
Mm-hmm.
we need to talk a little bit about Dante because
Mm.
he has had a major impact on how we view hell, and I think there's a lot of folks who don't really realize that so often when we're talking about hell and demons and things like that, we're channeling Dante, even though we haven't read them. We're channeling Dante and really not the Bible. So talk a little bit about Dante's influence on our understanding of these things.
Oh, the Inferno, I mean, just shaped the Christian imagination of what hell is, the kind of tortures that happen there, the idea that there are different levels, each with its own sort of classification of sin and requisite punishment. And then, of course, with Satan being at the center, one of the things that people don't realize is that Satan is encapsulated in ice, right? Um, and he has three mouths in Dante, and this is the key, I think, for interpreting Dante and interrogating our version of hell. It's to ask who are in those three mouths of Satan? Who gets the worst punishment of anybody? One of them is someone you might expect if you're a Christian, and that is Judas Iscariot, right? We can kind of see that he betrayed Jesus, sort of the ultimate betrayer, right? The other two are Brutus and Cassius. And if you're not a student of history, I'll tell you Brutus, and you are, so I'll tell your listeners. Brutus and Cassius were two of the men that led the conspiracy to kill Julius Caesar. And they both happened to be two of his best friends. The famous line, et tu, Brute, and you, Brutus. They betrayed Julius Caesar, the man who wanted to and whose son would become the first emperor of Rome. Why are they there? Like, that just seems like really arbitrary and really odd. Well, if you read history, you see that Dante was part of a very specific political organization known as the White Guelphs in Florence, Italy. And the White Guelphs wanted to bring about a restored Roman Empire. They thought that the Pope had gotten too powerful in the early medieval world, and that the vestiges of Roman Empire trappings up in Germany and stuff like that were not good enough. They wanted a return to that political reality. So what did Dante do? He put his political enemies, the ones who would betray the emperor, in hell, which is what I think all of us do.
Yeah.
Right? We want to put the people who don't think like us, who don't talk like us, who maybe don't share our culture and our values, those are the ones that we want to always say are worthy of divine punishment, right? Those are the ones who are unredeemable. Those are the ones who are enemies of God. And I really think that is the key for understanding Western Christianity's obsession with believing that hell is eternal torment. You can say it's fire, you can say it hurts, you can say all of these things, but people will draw a line every time when you start to say, well, maybe it's not eternal. Maybe it doesn't go on forever. Maybe that word in the Bible doesn't mean what we think it means when we say eternal. That's where people will flip out because we want to be able to imagine that some people are dirt, that some people are irredeemable, and that some people deserve nothing but wrath.
Yeah. Good point. Good point. One more thing. This is where I want to just kind of quibble a little bit.
Yeah.
I said I go to the edge of universalism and I can't quite jump into it. I find your arguments to be, very good, very strong, and but you bring up C.S. Lewis, and
Mm.
I have been influenced a lot by Lewis, and you raise the issue, and then you critique it somewhat, the idea that hell is where God lets us have what we want if God's love
Mm.
is non-coercive, and you poke at that in reference to the purging, that in order for us to freely make a decision, we got to be purged of all this stuff that gets in the way.
Mm.
Okay, fair argument. Um, but one of the things that I've thought a lot about of late with my interest in readings in quantum physics and cosmology is
Oh,
that and I'm realizing maybe asking you some things that you're not sure about, and I don't mean to do that, but
no,
it's
no.
just where I
Mm.
am, is that, it appears very clearly from what we know now is that for those of us who believe in a creator, that God created it, that because of evolutionary theory, because of evolution on the macro level, micro level, uh, John Polkinghorne, the late theologian, physicist, said that God builds freedom into the universe itself, that God must make a universe free and must make it free to make itself, make the universe to make itself.
Mm.
So what that means is not only is, as you say, God is love, that is correct, but by necessity, freedom is built into the universe, and that includes the stuff that doesn't go God's way.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
as I think about that, I'm thinking, if that's really the essence of freedom of the universe, then
Mm.
is that something that, if you will, if God tries to burn that off, is that in and of itself coercive? That's the
Oh,
question I'm raising.
that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. That's good. That's good. This kind of gets into um, probably the deepest and most, in my opinion, the most serious theological argument against this is all wrapped up in this freedom thing that you're talking about, right? Um, Especially you and I are both, we both have a reputation for being very hardcore Wesleyans, right? And wanting to preserve that character of free will. I don't have a solid answer for you. The only thing I can say is I've been thinking about this. I spoke a little bit to your friend Thomas Ord about it, who I think would probably share some of your concerns. but who nevertheless I think considers himself to be a universalist. Um, the best I can come up with is the idea that freedom is always relational. That it's really hard to talk about something having freedom in and of itself when it's not compared to something else,
Yeah.
right? So I am by nature free. Um, I am not free to fly, right? I am not free to shoot laser beams out of my eyes. I am free to go to the library and pick out any book I want. Now, if I go to North Korea, I don't have that same freedom, right? Um, so that can only lead me to say that God wants us to be free, but our freedom is not infinite.
Yeah.
Only God has perfect and infinite freedom. Um, and that's okay. Um, because I think of it, and I talk about this in my book. I make reference to my dogs, right? We have created, I mean, God created dogs, evolution created dogs. We have bred them to be our companions. If I opened up my front door and let my dog Beowulf just walk out into the street and choose for himself what he would do, I would not be increasing his freedom,
Right.
right? I would, in fact, be enslaving him to, getting hit by a car, eating poison, any number of catastrophes. When we are given freedom to point ourselves away from God, and this is kind of Augustinian. When we are given the freedom to point ourselves away from God, it's hard to call that freedom. And God gives us a long leash. God will let us stray and wander and even hurt each other. But I don't think God would let us fall into a pit. Um, Certainly not a pit of eternal torment, being a kind and loving father. But that's as good as I got for you. I mean, when you're dealing on that level, I just haven't put in the time,
Yeah.
with the philosophy around free will and determinism to be able to talk very intelligently about that.
No, you did pretty well, if you ask me. So I appreciate your response to that. There's no doubt you and I have agreement, and I think most people have thought about it, is that freedom doesn't mean being able to do whatever we want, and that's,
No.
in fact, Paul says in Galatians, that's the opposite. So that is true. So anyway, well, we'll have to leave it there. Derek, I just appreciate that you took time to talk about
Oh,
the
thank
book.
you.
You've
And
got
thank you for reading it.
yeah, you're working on another project, are you not?
I am. I am. This is it's a book trying to reintroduce the concept of anarcho-Christianity into the world. I think perhaps the time is right. We have reached the fullness of time here in American culture to reconsider the idea that God has very different political aspirations for us Christians than what we may have earlier thought.
Okay.
And so I'm doing my best to try to put that into words right now.
Well, that sounds like a good project. So I may have to do an interview with you on that book when it comes out. So
Sounds
that'll be
good.
good. That'll be good. All right, friends. Thanks to Vicar Derek. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to put the links to the book and places that you can get it. I would encourage you to check it out. It really is a good, thoughtful read. And don't forget, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to our channel on podcast. Follow us. Appreciate that. I'm Alan Bevere and your host. And a reminder that here at Faith Seeking Understanding, the patron saint of Faith Seeking Understanding is Anselm of Canterbury, who said, I do not understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand. So friends, keep seeking.